The noise complaint came in on a Wednesday evening at 8:54 p.m. A resident on Birchwood Commons Drive called the non-emergency line to report a persistent low-frequency hum coming from the property 2 doors down. Not loud enough to be disruptive, the caller said, but constant enough over the previous several weeks to become noticeable after dark when the neighborhood went quiet. It sounded, the caller said, like industrial ventilation equipment running continuously. It would stop for a day, then return. It had been going on intermittently for about 6 weeks. The deputy who took the call noted it as a standard noise ordinance matter. Birchwood Commons Drive was a residential cul-de-sac in the Sycamore Ridge subdivision of Kellerton Township, a community of roughly 14,000 people located in a wide suburban valley about 30 miles from the nearest metropolitan area. The subdivision was the kind that had been built in the mid-90s to attract young families. Matching mailboxes, a homeowners association newsletter, a community pool that was open Memorial Day through Labor Day. The houses were well maintained. The driveways were tidy. The kind of neighborhood where the biggest disputes were about leaf blowers and holiday lighting timelines. The address in question was a beige colonial on a corner lot, sold 3 years ago to a buyer who had paid cash, according to property records the deputy pulled before leaving the station. Current occupant listed as a single male, mid-40s, no prior contact with the sheriff's office. A business address was registered to the same name through the county's commercial licensing database. An import consultancy described in its registration as facilitating trade documentation for small and mid-sized businesses importing goods from East Asian markets. Registered 4 years ago. Annual renewals paid on time. No complaints on file. The deputy drove out to Birchwood Commons just before 9:30 p.m. He had his notepad and the standard expectation: someone running a window AC unit year-round, or a chest freezer in the garage with a struggling compressor, or a sump pump cycling in a wet basement. He had resolved 50 noise complaints. He did not expect this one to be different. The house was dark from the street. One light on in an upstairs room. No vehicles in the driveway. The deputy rang the front doorbell and waited. No answer. He rang again and knocked. Nothing. He walked around to the side of the house where the driveway met a fence gate leading to the backyard and paused there for a moment. The hum was real. Low, consistent, unmistakably mechanical. Coming from below grade, the cadence and resonance of it suggested something in or near the basement, running at a steady draw that spoke of continuous operation rather than a cycling appliance. He stood at the fence line and listened for a full minute. He also noticed something else, a faint but distinct chemical odor that he could not immediately name. Not paint, not gas. Something synthetic and sharp underneath a surface smell of dryer exhaust that suggested the property's ventilation was actively working to exhaust interior air outward. He stepped back to the street and called it in. He noted his observations, the hum, the chemical odor, the unoccupied appearance of the house, and requested a supervisor. He was careful in his language. He had a noise complaint and a chemical smell at a residential property. He did not yet have probable cause for anything beyond that. He knew the difference. His supervisor arrived at 10:08 p.m. The supervisor stood at the property line and confirmed both the hum and the smell. A brief consultation followed. The deputy noted the registered commercial activity at the address, the cash purchase, the single occupant status, and the fact that neighbors reported the hum had been occurring intermittently for 6 weeks. The supervisor agreed there was enough here to justify a knock and talk the following day, and if the occupant remained unavailable, a request to a county judge for a limited inspection warrant based on documented probable cause. The occupant was not home the following morning, nor in the afternoon. An attempt was made to reach the registered contact information for the import consultancy, phone numbers that rang to voicemail, an email address that returned an auto reply. A records check on the business entity conducted by the investigating deputy over the following 24 hours produced results that were not alarming in isolation, but accumulated into a pattern worth noting. The import consultancy had been registered with a county address different from the residential property, an office suite at a local business park. A visit to that office suite by the deputy found a space that had clearly not been actively used in some time. A desk, a printer still in its box, a stack of county-issued business compliance folders on a shelf, none of them opened. The probable cause affidavit was submitted to a county judge on a Friday morning. The warrant was granted by early afternoon. The entry team made contact with the property at 3:45 p.m. The occupant was still not home. The warrant authorized entry and inspection. 2 deputies, the supervisor, and a hazmat-certified officer from the county's emergency response unit approached the house with the appropriate protocols in place. The chemical smell and the continuous ventilation had prompted the precaution, and it would turn out to be entirely warranted. The main floor of the house was, in most respects, an ordinary home. Furniture, kitchen with dishes in the drying rack, a laptop on the coffee table, family photographs, staged, the kind bought as props rather than lived-in memories, the deputy would later note in his report. The hum was noticeably louder inside the house, vibrating slightly in the floor beneath their feet. The basement door was locked with a deadbolt that had been added to what was originally a standard interior door. Not unusual in itself, but the quality of the lock was commercial grade, the kind installed in environments where security is a professional consideration rather than a domestic afterthought. The warrant covered the full property. The lock was breached. The basement of the house on Birchwood Commons Drive had been converted, with considerable engineering precision, into a clandestine chemical synthesis laboratory. The space had been divided into 3 distinct zones by interior walls that were not original to the structure: a staging area near the stairs, a primary production space in the center of the basement, and a sealed room at the far end that was operating under negative pressure, kept below the ambient air pressure of the rest of the basement to prevent chemical vapors from migrating outward. The negative pressure system was what the hum was. Commercial-grade exhaust fans running continuously, cycling basement air through a filtration and neutralization stack before venting it into the home's existing HVAC exhaust system, a sophisticated concealment method designed to mask the chemical signature of the production process from exterior observation. The deputy and the hazmat officer halted entry at the basement stairs, pending full protective equipment deployment. The scope of what was visible from that position, the scale of the equipment, the volume of chemical precursors and finished product secured in labeled and organized storage containers, the sophistication of the ventilation and filtration infrastructure was immediately clear to the hazmat officer as something far beyond a personal or small-scale operation. The laboratory had been producing synthetic opioids. The specific compounds identified by forensic chemistry analysis in the days following the discovery were fentanyl analogs, variants of the base compound engineered to differ slightly in molecular structure from controlled substance schedules in ways that temporarily placed them in legal ambiguity before rescheduling could occur. The production volume, estimated from the quantity of precursor chemicals on hand and the yield capacity of the equipment, indicated that the laboratory had been operating at a scale capable of supplying not a local market, but a regional distribution network covering multiple counties and, according to federal investigators who joined the case within 48 hours of the initial discovery, potentially several states. The operation had been running, forensic and documentary evidence indicated, for approximately 4 years. It had been inside the house on Birchwood Commons Drive for 3 of those 4 years. Before the residential location, evidence recovered from communication devices and records found in the property suggested a prior production site elsewhere in the county. A commercial space that had been quietly vacated when the occupant purchased the residential property and converted its basement. 4 years. A residential cul-de-sac in a homeowners association subdivision. The community pool 3 blocks away. The elementary school whose bus stop was at the corner of Birchwood Commons Drive and the main subdivision road. 43 children passing within 120 feet of the property every school morning. The occupant of the home was arrested at a regional airport 2 days after the initial discovery, attempting to board a flight with a connecting itinerary that federal investigators assessed as a flight risk profile rather than a planned trip. He was taken into custody without incident and charged with an extensive list of federal and state offenses, including manufacturing of controlled substance analogs, conspiracy to distribute, and related charges that continued to be refined as the investigation expanded. the federal element of the investigation became central within the first week. The communication devices and encrypted records recovered from the property, decoded by federal forensic analysts over a period of weeks, established operational connections between the Kellerton Township laboratory and a criminal distribution network with organizational roots in transnational criminal enterprises operating across multiple countries. The precursor chemicals used in the synthesis process had been sourced through a layered chain of import and transit intermediaries that routed materials through legal commercial channels in ways specifically designed to fragment the paper trail and avoid triggering controlled substance precursor reporting requirements. The operation was not improvised. It was the product of sophisticated organizational knowledge about regulatory structures, supply chain management, and concealment methodology. The distribution side of the network, as federal investigators traced it, extended from the Kellerton Township production point outward through a series of regional brokers and street-level distribution nodes spanning at least 4 states. The synthetic opioids produced in the basement on Birchwood Commons Drive had reached end users through distribution channels investigators were still fully mapping at the time public statements were made about the case. The harm attributable to the operation's output was, in the assessment of federal drug enforcement officials involved in the case, substantial and ongoing at the time of the discovery. But the laboratory and its operator were not the only story the investigation uncovered. Among the documents recovered from the property, both physical files and encrypted digital records, were communications and transaction records that referenced regulatory management, county-level compliance and inspection activity, business license processes, inspection waivers and sign-off documentation, payments. The investigators who flagged these records brought the county sheriff's office and to the county's business licensing and compliance office within the first week. What followed was an internal inquiry that ran parallel to the federal investigation and concluded, within 6 weeks of the initial discovery, in a second arrest. A senior licensing compliance inspector employed by Kellerton County's Business Development and Regulatory Office had been with the county for 11 years. He was, by standard professional account, a diligent and unremarkable public servant, present at his desk, professional in his conduct, regular in his inspection schedules, and well regarded by the small business community he served. He had processed hundreds of business registrations, conducted thousands of compliance inspections, and been recognized in a county employee service review 3 years earlier for maintaining the lowest rate of outstanding violations in his district. People in Kellerton Township's small business community knew his name. They did not fear his inspections. They trusted his clearances. For a period of approximately 3.5 years, beginning roughly 6 months after the residential laboratory was established on Birchwood Commons Drive, this inspector had accepted payments routed through the same layered intermediary network that supplied the laboratory's chemical precursors. The payments were not large by absolute measure. They ranged from $800 to $2,200 per transaction, made quarterly, deposited through a series of intermediary transfers into a personal account that the inspector had established outside his primary banking relationship. The total over the full period of the arrangement was estimated by forensic accountants at slightly under $90,000. In exchange, the inspector had provided a specific and recurring service, ensuring that the residential address on Birchwood Commons Drive never appeared in the county's active inspection queue for any regulatory review connected to the commercial registration associated with the property's occupant. When the import consultancy's registration required annual renewal, the inspector processed the paperwork. When a neighboring business's inspection generated a geographic cluster review that would normally have flagged adjacent registered addresses for follow-up, the inspector removed the residential address from the generated list before it reached field inspection scheduling. On 2 specific occasions documented in recovered communications, the inspector had been alerted by the network that a regulatory inquiry was approaching the address, once from a county assessor's office review, once from a state commercial activity audit, and it intervened at the file level to route those inquiries away before they could produce on-site visits. He had not set foot in the house on Birchwood Commons Drive. He had never met its occupant in person. His entire function in the arrangement was administrative and remote, a hand inside the county's regulatory machinery, quietly ensuring that the paper processes that should have produced physical inspection, visits to that address never resulted in anyone actually going there. For 3.5 years, it had worked. The county's compliance infrastructure had functioned normally in every other respect. The inspector had continued to process hundreds of routine inspections across his district. He had continued to attend staff meetings and submit quarterly reports. He had continued to be, in every observable dimension, a competent and professional county employee. And on Birchwood Commons Drive, 2 doors down from the neighbor who would eventually call in a noise complaint, the laboratory had continued to operate. The inspector was arrested at his home on a Tuesday morning, 5.5 weeks after the initial discovery. He did not resist. He declined to answer questions without counsel present. He was charged with bribery, obstruction of justice, and multiple conspiracy counts connected to his role in the distribution network's operational security. His attorney issued a statement noting that his client maintained his innocence and would contest all charges. The county placed him on administrative leave pending the outcome of proceedings and initiated an immediate review of all business compliance records processed under his account for the previous 5 years. The review identified 4 additional commercial registrations connected to the same criminal network that the inspector had processed or administratively managed. 3 of those registrations were for shell entities with no genuine operational activity. Companies that existed on paper as part of the financial routing infrastructure used to move money and distribute precursor sourcing costs across the network's supply chain. 1 registration for a small freight coordination company operating out of an industrial park 14 miles from Kellerton Township was found upon investigation to be a legitimately licensed business that had been used as an unwitting relay point in the chemical precursor import chain. Its operators unaware that some of the freight documentation they processed was connected to anything other than ordinary commercial goods. The residential laboratory on Birchwood Commons Drive was remediated by a licensed hazmat contractor over a period of 11 days. The negative pressure containment room, the production equipment, the chemical storage, the ventilation and filtration infrastructure, all of it was carefully removed, decontaminated, and disposed of under federal environmental protocols. The house was subsequently secured as a property asset pending legal proceedings. The neighborhood processed the discovery in the way that small communities process revelations of this kind, slowly, with discomfort, and with a persistent undercurrent of the question that neighbors kept coming back to in conversation and in the comments sections of the local news coverage. How did we not know? The family next door had exchanged small talk with the occupant over the fence in summer. A neighbor down the street had accepted a delivered package for him once when he wasn't home. Children who waited for the school bus at the corner of Birchwood Commons and the main road had stood 43 steps from the property's front door approximately 160 mornings a year for 3 years. None of them had known. There had been nothing visible to know. The house had been a house. The man had been a neighbor. The hum had been a hum that most people had tuned out long before the one resident who didn't tune it out had finally picked up the phone. Kellerton Township responded to the discovery by convening an emergency review of residential inspection protocols, commercial licensing oversight procedures, and the county's framework for regulatory cross-referencing between residential and commercial addresses. New redundancies were established requiring dual inspector sign-off on any administrative routing change that removed a registered commercial address from an inspection cycle. An external audit of the Business Compliance Office's records going back 7 years was commissioned. The county sheriff's office issued a public statement praising the vigilance of the responding deputy and the professional conduct of the investigation team. Federal partners were acknowledged. The community was reminded that victim support resources were available and that the investigation was ongoing. It had started with a hum, low, persistent, and just constant enough to be wrong. Kellerton Township has a homeowners association and a community pool and a bus stop where children wait in the morning. It is, in almost every dimension, an ordinary American suburb. For 4 years, a laboratory producing synthetic opioids had operated in its residential interior, sustained by a chemical supply chain routed through international commercial networks and protected from regulatory discovery, by a county employee who had been quietly trusted to do his job and had made a different choice instead. The deputy who responded to the noise complaint on a Wednesday evening had no reason to expect anything unusual. He had noted a sound and a smell. He had followed protocol. He had been disciplined enough not to overreach and patient enough to build a proper evidentiary case before a warrant was sought. He had done the work the way the work is supposed to be done. That is what Sheriff Patrol exists to document. The routine call that turned out not to be routine, the deputy who noticed what most people would have dismissed, and the years of hidden harm that ended because someone in a subdivision on a quiet evening thought a hum sounded wrong and decided to say something. The house on Birchwood Commons Drive is silent now. The pool 3 blocks away opens again in the summer. The school bus still stops at the corner. The neighborhood is the same as it was, except that it knows something now that it didn't know before, about what can hide inside the familiar, and about how close it can be before someone finally notices. This is a fictional dramatization inspired by law enforcement concepts and publicly documented investigative patterns. No real cases, individuals, or specific locations are depicted. All characters, addresses, and community details are entirely invented.